The telegram arrived at Downing Street on the morning of the 28th of October, 1940. It was short. It was, in its way, almost polite. Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano had delivered it personally to the Greek Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the manner of men who have already made up their minds. The ultimatum demanded that Greece allow Italian forces to occupy strategic positions on Greek territory, effective immediately. Metaxas, a conservative general who had ruled Greece as a dictator since 1936, read it carefully. Then he refused. The war that followed would consume his country, reshape the strategic map of Europe, and force a British prime minister into one of the most consequential and debated decisions of the entire conflict. In London, Winston Churchill had been watching the Mediterranean with the focused intensity of a man who understood that geography, in war, was destiny. Since the fall of France in June of 1940, Britain had stood effectively alone against the Axis powers. The empire's position in the Mediterranean through Gibraltar, Malta, Alexandria, and the Suez Canal was not merely a matter of prestige. It was the arterial route to oil, to India, to the empire's ability to continue fighting at all. When Greece entered the war by virtue of Italy's unprovoked aggression, Churchill saw something he had rarely been offered since the fall of France: an opportunity. Here was a sovereign nation in continental Europe actively resisting the Axis. Here was a front that could be supported, reinforced, and perhaps transformed into the kind of second pressure point that would divide Hitler's strategic attention. Churchill threw his personal enthusiasm behind the idea of aiding Greece with characteristic force. What followed was a campaign that would cost Britain 11,840 men captured or killed, the loss of irreplaceable equipment in the eastern Mediterranean, and a delay to the North African offensive that some historians argue altered the entire trajectory of the Desert War. Whether Churchill's decision to intervene was a bold act of strategic solidarity or a catastrophic misreading of military reality has been argued ever since. To understand it properly, you have to go back to the beginning, to the world as it looked from London in the autumn of 1940, before the German columns had begun to mass along the Bulgarian frontier. The Italian attack on Greece had not gone according to plan. Benito Mussolini had launched his invasion on the 28th of October, 1940, through Albania, which Italy had occupied since 1939. The Duce had expected a swift, humiliating collapse, the kind of rapid conquest that would restore Italian martial prestige after the embarrassments of the early North African campaign and demonstrate to Hitler that Italy was a genuine great power, capable of independent initiative. Instead, the Greeks had fought back with a ferocity that stunned not only Rome but every European capital still capable of paying attention. By mid-November, the Greek army had not merely halted the Italian advance. It had thrown it back across the Albanian border and was pressing deep into Italian-controlled territory. By the end of November, the Greeks had captured Korçë, one of the principal Albanian towns. By January of 1941, they controlled roughly a quarter of Albania. Mussolini was furious and humiliated, and Hitler, who had not been consulted about the attack and had in fact been infuriated by it, was now confronted with a strategic problem he had not anticipated. The Führer had been planning, since the summer of 1940, for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was to be the great ideological and territorial campaign, the war that would secure Lebensraum in the East and destroy Bolshevism. For Barbarossa to succeed, Hitler needed his southern flank secured. He needed Romanian oil, flowing through the Ploiești fields, protected from any threat. He needed Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria firmly within the Axis orbit. And he needed the Balkans quiet. A war raging in Greece with British aircraft potentially operating from Greek airfields within striking distance of the Romanian oil fields was exactly the kind of strategic irritant that could not be permitted. The Germans had begun planning Operation Marita, the invasion of Greece, as early as December of 1940. By February of 1941, German troops had begun massing in Romania. By the 1st of March, Bulgaria had signed the Tripartite Pact and joined the Axis, opening its territory to German forces. The pressure on Greece was becoming inexorable. It was in this context that Churchill made his decision. On the 12th of February 1941, He sent his Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff General Sir John Dill to Cairo and then to Athens to assess the situation and negotiate British support. The British already had a small presence in Greece. Royal Air Force squadrons had been operating from Greek airfields since November of 1940, and there had been ongoing discussion about the extent of any potential land commitment. But what Churchill was now contemplating was something categorically different. A substantial expeditionary force, drawn from the army in North Africa that was at that precise moment in the middle of its most successful campaign of the war. General Archibald Wavell's Western Desert Force had, between December of 1940 and February of 1941, conducted one of the most brilliantly executed offensive operations in British military history. Beginning with Operation Compass in December, the British and Commonwealth forces had routed the Italian 10th Army, advancing 500 miles across Cyrenaica and capturing 130,000 Italian prisoners, 400 tanks, and 845 guns, for the loss of fewer than 2,000 men killed and wounded. By early February, they had taken Benghazi. The road to Tripoli seemed open. General Richard O'Connor, commanding the force on the ground, believed that with continued pressure the Italian position in Libya could be completely destroyed. He was almost certainly right. Instead, the order came from London to halt. Forces would be redirected to Greece. The man Churchill sent to oversee the Greek expedition was General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson, known to everyone in the army as Jumbo Wilson, a large, phlegmatic figure whose outward calm sometimes concealed a sharp, analytical mind. Wilson's force, designated W Force, would eventually comprise the 1st Armored Brigade under Brigadier Harold Charrington, the 2nd New Zealand Division under General Bernard Freyberg, a Victoria Cross holder from the First World War and one of the most decorated soldiers in the Empire, and the 6th Australian Division under General Sir Ivan Mackay. In total, the British commitment would amount to approximately 58,000 men. It was a substantial force. It was also, as events would prove, insufficient, and it was being asked to defend a country whose military geography presented some of the most formidable defensive challenges in Europe. Greece is not a country that yields easily to military planners. Its topography is defined by mountain ranges that run roughly north to south, by narrow coastal plains, by river valleys that can channel an army or trap it, and by a coastline so broken and indented that evacuation, if it came to that, would be a nightmare of logistics. The northern frontier with Bulgaria, behind which German forces were now assembling, was guarded by the Metaxas Line, a chain of 21 fortification complexes stretching for roughly 96 miles along the Bulgarian border, named after the Greek prime minister who had ordered its construction. The largest of these fortifications was Fort Rupel, built into the rocky hills of the Strymon Valley. The line was designed along the principles that had governed European frontier defense in the interwar period, the assumption that fixed fortifications, properly manned and supplied, could absorb and blunt an attacker's momentum long enough for reserves to arrive and counterattack. The problem was that the Metaxas Line was not properly manned. The Greek army had 12 divisions on the Albanian front, locked in the grinding offensive against the Italians that Metaxas himself had committed Greece to when he rejected the Italian ultimatum. General Alexandros Papagos, the Greek commander-in-chief, faced an impossible arithmetic. He could not simultaneously maintain the pressure on the Italians in Albania, garrison the Metaxas Line in sufficient strength, and form a coherent defensive line in cooperation with the arriving British forces. He had asked Britain for 9 divisions. He was getting 3, and not the armored, mechanized formations that might have compensated for their numbers, but infantry and a single armored brigade equipped with aging cruiser and light tanks. The defensive line that Wilson eventually established ran along the Aliakmon River, from the coast near Katerini westward through Edessa to the hills above Florina. It was the logical position from a purely geographical standpoint. It was also a position that left Salonika, the second city of Greece, and the entire province of Eastern Macedonia, outside the defensive perimeter. This was the core of the strategic dilemma that would haunt the entire campaign. To defend the Metaxas Line and hold Salonika, Greek forces needed to remain in Eastern Macedonia. To link up with the British on the Aliakmon Line, they needed to withdraw westward before the German attack began. Papagos, who resisted abandoning Greek territory before the Germans had even struck, delayed the withdrawal. Wilson, who needed the Greek divisions on his flank to make the Aliakmon position viable, found that when the German attack came, The junction between his forces and the Greek Eastern Macedonian army section had not been properly completed. It was a fatal gap, and the Germans, with the ruthless professional efficiency that had already destroyed France, Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Yugoslavia, would find it. On the 27th of March, 1941, a coup d'état in Belgrade altered the picture momentarily. The new Yugoslav government, hostile to the Axis and encouraged by British diplomacy, signaled its willingness to resist German pressure. Churchill was elated. He saw in Yugoslavia the possibility of a Balkan front, a coalition of Greece, Yugoslavia, and perhaps Turkey that could hold the Germans in the south while Britain consolidated its position in the eastern Mediterranean. Yesterday morning, he cabled Eden on the 28th of March, the news from Yugoslavia electrified us here. He spoke of a Balkan front, with the enthusiasm of a man who sees a promising hand where moments before there was almost nothing. The enthusiasm was premature. The Yugoslav army, though large on paper, with some 28 divisions, was poorly equipped, ethnically divided, and had received almost none of the material support that Churchill had promised. Its officer corps was split between factions sympathetic to the Axis and those loyal to the new government. Its mobilization plans were outdated. Its air force, equipped largely with obsolete aircraft, was destroyed on the ground on the first day of the German attack. Hitler, when he learned of the Belgrade coup, was incandescent with rage. He convened an immediate military conference and ordered that Yugoslavia be crushed with merciless harshness before Barbarossa. Operation Marita was revised to include the simultaneous invasion of both Yugoslavia and Greece. The 12th Army of Field Marshal Wilhelm List, already assembled along the Bulgarian frontier, was now directed to execute both operations simultaneously. The scale of what was coming bore no relation to what Wilson's force could realistically resist. List's 12th Army comprised 5 armored panzer divisions, 2 motorized divisions, 3 mountain divisions, and multiple infantry divisions, supported by more than 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft. Against this, Wilson could deploy 1 armored brigade with 176 tanks, 45 aircraft, and 3 divisions of infantry holding a line nearly 100 miles long. The disparity in armor alone made a sustained defense almost mathematically impossible. The British tanks were a mixture of cruiser tanks, fast but mechanically unreliable and lightly armored, and infantry tanks that were too slow to conduct the kind of fluid, mobile defense that the terrain and the German operational method would demand. The Luftwaffe would have effective air superiority from the first hours of the campaign. Every road, every supply line, every concentration of troops would be visible from the air and vulnerable to attack. At 5:15 in the morning on the 6th of April, 1941, the German invasion began simultaneously against both Greece and Yugoslavia. Boehm's 18th Mountain Corps launched its assault against the Metaxas Line. Stumm's 40th Panzer Corps drove into southern Yugoslavia. The German declaration of war was delivered to the Greek government at the same moment that the artillery opened fire on Fort Rappel. What happened at the Metaxas Line in the first days of the German assault was simultaneously a testament to Greek military courage and a confirmation of the strategic impossibility of the position. The fortifications, though undermanned, were held by soldiers who understood they were defending their own soil and who had spent years preparing for exactly this attack. When the 18th Mountain Corps struck Fort Rappel with concentrated artillery fire, expecting the concrete to give way and the garrison to break, neither happened. The Greek defenders repelled the initial assault. They repelled the second. Even as the Germans infiltrated the ground around the fort and began to identify the positions of the Greek guns for more precise counter-battery fire, the garrison held. It would cost the Germans more than 300 killed around Rappel alone, against 56 Greek dead, a ratio that spoke to the quality of the fortifications and the determination of the men inside them. But courage at Rappel could not compensate for what was happening 80 miles to the west. The 2nd Panzer Division, part of Stumm's corps, had driven through southern Yugoslavia with almost no resistance, crossed the mountains, and descended into northern Greece through the Axios Valley. Exactly the weak seam between the Metaxas Line and Wilson's Aliakman position that the strategic plan had never adequately addressed. On the 7th of April, the panzers crossed the hills south of Lake Doiran. General Lumbaz, commanding the Greek forces in that sector, found his position turned and was forced to retreat. On the 8th of April, Salonika fell. General Bakopoulos, commanding the Eastern Macedonia Army section, found his forces completely isolated. The Metaxas line cut off from the rest of the Greek defenses by the German thrust through Yugoslavia, the city behind him in German hands, his men exhausted and without hope of relief. He asked for a truce. Field Marshal List accepted, with terms that reflected the Germans' genuine respect for the Greek resistance. Captured officers were permitted to retain their sidearms, and List pledged that none of them would be sent to a concentration camp. The Metaxas line had been held militarily but had been rendered strategically irrelevant by the German envelopment through Yugoslavia in less than 3 days. The entire eastern anchor of the Greek defensive system was gone. Wilson was now fighting without his flank, and the German armored columns were turning southward, toward the Ali Akman line and everything beyond it. We're just past the halfway mark of this story. If you want to understand how Britain's decisions in Greece shaped the entire Mediterranean War, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. The Greek army in Albania was still fighting. General Georgios Tsalakagla, commanding the Epirus army on the Western Front, had launched the joint offensive with the Yugoslavians against the Italian forces on the 6th of April, the same morning the Germans crossed the Bulgarian frontier. Initially, it had gone well. The Greeks, who by this point had 18 months of combat experience against the Italians and knew the terrain of southern Albania better than any other army in the world, were advancing. But on the 7th of April, Skopje fell to the Germans, knocking Yugoslavia out of the fight. By the 10th of April, news of Salonika's fall had reached the Albanian front. Tsalakagla stopped the offensive. There was no longer any point in advancing further into Albania when the German flood was pouring through northern Greece behind him. Wilson's position on the Ali Akman line was already becoming untenable. The 9th Panzer Division, advancing through the Monastir Valley after breaking the Yugoslav resistance in the north, was pressing toward Kozani, a move that threatened to cut off not only the British forces on the Ali Akman but also the Greek army withdrawing from Albania. If the Monastir Pass fell, if the Germans reached Kozani and turned south, Tsalakagla's army would be encircled. The whole western wing of the Greek defense, everything that had been built through months of painful fighting against Italy, would be trapped. Wilson ordered a withdrawal from the Ali Akman line on the 8th of April, before the position had even been properly tested, because the strategic situation had already made it indefensible. The retreating columns, New Zealanders, Australians, British armor, began moving south through roads that the Luftwaffe was watching constantly, through mountain passes that offered magnificent defensive positions but also terrifying bottlenecks if the German air superiority was fully exploited. The logistics of the retreat were managed with considerable professional competence given the circumstances, but the fundamental reality was that Wilson was conducting a fighting withdrawal with a force that had never had a realistic chance of holding the country it had been sent to defend. The question that hung over every mile of that withdrawal, a question that the soldiers could not afford to ask but that the historians would spend decades examining, was whether it had ever been possible for Churchill's gamble to succeed. The answer required an honest accounting not only of the forces involved but of the assumptions that had driven the decision in the first place. To answer that question honestly, you have to go back to the conversations that took place in Athens and Cairo in February and March of 1941, in the weeks before the first German shell fell on Fort Rupel. You have to sit, in a sense, in the rooms where the decisions were made and understand what the men making them actually knew, what they believed, and what they chose to ignore. Anthony Eden and General Dill had arrived in Cairo on the 19th of February. They met with Wavell, with the commanders of the Middle East forces, and then flew to Athens for a series of conferences with Papagos and the Greek government. What they found was not encouraging. Papagos made clear that the Greek army was stretched to its absolute limit, 12 divisions in Albania, 4 on the Metaxas line, and very little in reserve. He was blunt about what British assistance would need to look like to be militarily meaningful. He wanted 9 divisions. He wanted them equipped with armor and artillery. He wanted them deployed forward in coordination with the Greek forces, not as a separate national contingent operating on a different axis. What he was offered, 3 divisions, 1 armored brigade, and a commitment that was explicitly framed in London as much for political as for military reasons, fell far short of what he had asked for. The political dimension of Churchill's thinking has to be understood clearly, because it shaped the decision at least as much as any military calculation. Churchill was not, in February of 1941, primarily calculating whether a British force of 58,000 men could hold northern Greece against 12 German divisions equipped with 5 panzer formations. He knew, or should have known, that the answer was almost certainly no. What he was calculating was something more complex and, in his own strategic framework, more important. He was calculating the effect on American opinion. He was calculating the message that abandoning Greece, leaving the one nation in continental Europe still actively resisting the Axis to its fate, would send to Washington, to the neutral powers, to the occupied peoples of Europe who were watching to see whether Britain would fight or merely survive. The Lend-Lease Act had just passed the American Congress on the 11th of March 1941. The relationship with Roosevelt was the cornerstone of British strategic survival. Churchill believed, and he was not entirely wrong, that Britain's moral credibility, its identity as the champion of small nations against aggression, was a strategic asset as real as any armored division. Eden, for his part, was persuaded during his Athens meetings that the Greek government genuinely wanted British support and that Papagos was committed to a serious defense. He cabled London on the 22nd of February recommending that the expedition proceed. Dill, who was more skeptical and who privately harbored serious doubts about the military viability of the operation, nevertheless endorsed the recommendation. Wavell, who understood better than anyone what stripping forces from North Africa would cost, acquiesced. There is a kind of institutional momentum visible in the documentary record of those weeks, each man deferring slightly to the others, each unwilling to be the one who told Churchill that the thing he passionately wanted to do was not militarily feasible. Churchill himself, when presented with the Chiefs of Staff assessments that noted the risks, chose to read them as endorsements rather than warnings. There was one voice that was consistently and clearly skeptical. General Sir Thomas Blamey, commanding the Australian Imperial Force in the Middle East, told his government in Canberra with considerable directness that he did not believe the operation could succeed. The Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies, who was in London during February and March and who attended several war cabinet meetings, shared Blamey's unease. Menzies later wrote that he had found Churchill's confidence about Greece difficult to reconcile with the intelligence assessments he had seen. But the political pressure, the sense that refusing to go would be a betrayal of an ally under attack, that it would destroy whatever prospect remained of building a Balkan coalition, overwhelmed the military doubts. The withdrawal that Wilson was now conducting through the mountains of central Greece was, under these circumstances, a masterpiece of professional competence operating inside an impossible situation. The rearguard actions fought by the New Zealanders and Australians during the retreat deserve to be remembered with the same respect accorded to more famous last stands, because the men fighting them understood exactly what they were doing and why. They were not trying to win. They were trying to buy time, hours, sometimes only minutes, for the columns behind them to reach the next defensible position, to cross the next river, to get one more convoy of trucks around the next mountain bend before the panzers arrived. At Clitty Pass, on the 11th and 12th of April, Mackay's 6th Australian Division held the key crossing between the towns of Vevey and Clitty against the 9th Panzer Division, reinforced by the SS Adolf Hitler Regiment under Joseph Dietrich. The Germans used the same combination of armored thrust and infiltrating infantry that had broken every defensive line from the Ardennes to the Aegean. Dietrich's SS troops pushed back the Australians from several key hills, opening the pass. But Charrington's 1st Armored Brigade appeared at Talameda at the critical moment and covered the Australian withdrawal, preventing what might have been a rout from becoming an annihilation. Mackay's force had suffered significant casualties. It had also gained 2 days that allowed other units to reach the Olympus Line and begin the next phase of the withdrawal. On the Olympus Line itself, the fighting was equally intense and equally weighted toward the same conclusion. The 2nd New Zealand Division, deployed along the coastal pass at Platamon and through the mountain approaches to Olympus, held the Germans for 3 days, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of April, against the full weight of the 18th Corps and elements of Stumm's panzer forces. Freiberg's New Zealanders were among the best trained soldiers in the British Empire, and they demonstrated it in those 3 days with a tenacity that repeatedly forced German units to pay in blood for ground they had assumed they could simply drive through. But when Wilson finally ordered the withdrawal on the 17th of April, the arithmetic of the situation was unanswerable. The Italian army, sensing the German success, had retaken course on the Albanian front. The prospect of total encirclement was real. The retreat from Olympus led south through Larissa, through the plains of Thessaly, toward the narrow coastal pass where, 2,500 years earlier, 300 Spartans had held a Persian army for 3 days and given their lives to the proposition that some things are worth dying for. Thermopylae. The name carried a weight in 1941 that the men who would fight there were entirely conscious of. Wilson chose the Thermopylae line as his final defensive position, the place where his forces would make their last stand to gain the time needed to evacuate as much of the expeditionary force as possible. The Thermopylae position was not, by April of 1941, the narrow coastal defile that Leonidas had defended. 2.5 millennia of silt from the Spercheios River had broadened the coastal plain significantly, and the fortifications that had been constructed along the line were, as the official British history records, still incomplete and not well developed beyond their initial stage. Wilson deployed Freyberg's 2nd New Zealand Division to defend the coastal pass and Mackay's 6th Australian Division to hold the village of Brallows in the hills to the west. Between them, these formations would constitute the rearguard, the men who would stay while everyone else left. The German attack on the Thermopylae line began on the 22nd of April. The 5th Panzer Division, reinforced with well-camouflaged artillery and supported by motorcycle infantry, launched probing attacks against the New Zealand positions. They were repelled. The Germans tried again the following day, this time with a wider enveloping movement through the difficult terrain west of the pass, simultaneously with an outflanking thrust by a motorcycle battalion advancing through the coastal town of Molos. Wilson, reading the situation, ordered the withdrawal from Thermopylae on the 23rd of April. He left one brigade in each sector, the 19th Australian Brigade and the 6th New Zealand Brigade, with orders to hold as long as possible while the remaining forces made for the evacuation beaches. On the 24th of April, those 2 brigades held against a full German assault for the entire day. Against artillery, against armor, against Luftwaffe aircraft that could range freely over the battlefield, the Australians and New Zealanders held Thermopylae, not for 3 days as Leonidas had, but for 1. It was enough. The evacuation convoys had the time they needed. Under the cover of darkness, the rearguard withdrew toward the beaches and set up a final blocking position at Thebes. The evacuation itself, Operation Demon, was conducted over 5 nights between the 24th and the 30th of April, 1941. It was in many ways a smaller, grimmer version of Dunkirk, conducted without the English Channel's relative proximity to home ports, without the shallow beaches that had allowed the small boats to come in close, without the advantage of continuous air cover. The Royal Navy used every port and beach along the Peloponnesian coast: Nafplio, Kalamata, Monemvasia, Porto Rafti, working in darkness to avoid the Luftwaffe and the German forces that were now pressing south from every direction. Dietrich's SS regiment had advanced from Ioannina down the western coast of Greece, crossed to the Peloponnese at Patras, and was driving toward the Isthmus of Corinth. On the 26th of April, 2 battalions of the 2nd German Parachute Regiment dropped at the Gulf of Corinth in an airborne operation designed to cut off the retreating British forces at the isthmus. The paratroopers seized the Corinth Bridge briefly before British explosives destroyed a span of it. But the main body of Wilson's force had already crossed. The Germans and the paratroopers met at Corinth, then raced south toward Kalamata. They arrived too late to prevent the bulk of the evacuation, but in time to capture approximately 8,000 soldiers, British, Australian, New Zealand, and Yugoslav, who had reached Kalamata but could not be taken off before the German forces closed the port. For those men, the war would continue behind wire in German prison camps for the next 4 years. For the 50,000 who did get away, most of them transported to Crete, some to Egypt, the immediate future held little comfort. They arrived without most of their heavy equipment, without their vehicles, without their artillery. The 6th Australian Division alone lost virtually all of its transport and support weapons. The 1st Armored Brigade's tanks, which could not be loaded onto the evacuation ships, were destroyed or abandoned on the roads of the Peloponnese. In terms of material, the Greek campaign cost the Middle East command equipment that would take months to replace. Months during which Rommel's Afrika Korps was consolidating its position in Libya and preparing to drive back toward Egypt. The human cost was 11,840 men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Against this, the Germans lost approximately 5,000 men in the entire Balkan campaign, across both Yugoslavia and Greece. The disparity reflected not a failure of British or Commonwealth courage, but the fundamental imbalance in the forces committed. The Greek army itself had suffered far more grievously over the course of the entire campaign. First against the Italians through the winter of 1940 to 41, then in the disintegration of the Northern Front under the German assault, and finally in the capitulation of Tsalakogla's Epirus army in the west. Tsalakogla, recognizing that continued resistance would serve only to get more of his men killed with no strategic purpose, had offered to surrender his forces to the Germans on the 20th of April, bypassing the Italians, whom his army had spent 6 months fighting, in a gesture of professional soldiers' respect for an enemy who had beaten him fairly. The terms were the same as those offered to Bacopoulos in the east: sidearms retained, no concentration camps, men released to go home when the campaign ended. List accepted. The fall of Greece was confirmed on the 27th of April, 1941, when motorcycle troops of Boehm's 18th Corps entered Athens. The Athenians had known it was coming for several days. The city was quiet, its residents confined to their homes. The Germans raised the swastika over the Acropolis, over the Parthenon, over the ruins of the civilization from which European democracy had drawn its foundational vocabulary. The image was one of the most powerful pieces of German propaganda photography of the war, and it was also, in the way that the most powerful images sometimes are, a statement of something true about the moment. The last nation in continental Europe had fallen. Britain was, once again, effectively alone on land. The debate about Churchill's decision began almost immediately and has never fully ended. The case for the prosecution is straightforward and rests on a foundation of hard numbers. Britain stripped its most successful North African campaign of its follow-through forces at the precise moment when total victory in Libya was within reach. O'Connor's force, had it been allowed to continue toward Tripoli, might well have destroyed the Italian position in North Africa before Rommel arrived with the Afrika Korps in February of 1941. Instead, Wavell was ordered to halt, to send his best formations to Greece, and the German armored force that arrived in Libya found the British positions weakened and the momentum of the desert offensive dissipated. The subsequent 18 months of grinding back-and-forth warfare in the Western Desert, which cost tens of thousands of casualties on both sides and consumed resources that might have been decisive elsewhere, has been laid in part at the door of the Greek decision. The evacuation cost Britain equipment it could not quickly replace. The troops who escaped went to Crete, where many of them would face another German assault within weeks and suffer another defeat. The strategic dividend Churchill had hoped for, a Balkan coalition, American approval, a demonstration of British resolution, yielded far less than the price paid. The case for the defense is more nuanced and rests on arguments that Churchill himself made, with considerable force at the time and afterward. The Greek campaign, he contended, was not a military venture but a political and moral necessity. To have abandoned Greece, to have stood by while Hitler's armies overran the one nation in Europe that was actively fighting, would have destroyed Britain's credibility as an ally, would have confirmed to every neutral government watching that Britain's promises were worthless, and might have made it impossible to ever again recruit any nation to stand alongside it. The Americans, whose material support through Lend-Lease was the foundation of Britain's continued ability to fight, were watching. The Arabs of the Middle East, whose oil and whose territory were essential to British strategy, were watching. The Indians, whose contribution to the imperial war effort was enormous, were watching. Churchill's calculation was that some costs are worth paying not because they produce immediate military advantage but because they sustain the moral architecture of the alliance without which ultimate victory is impossible. There is also the matter of the Metaxas line and what the German timetable tells us about the deeper strategic picture. The Greek campaign, along with the Yugoslav resistance, forced Hitler to delay the launch of Barbarossa by approximately 5 to 6 weeks, from its originally planned date in mid-May to the 22nd of June, 1941. Some historians, notably John Keegan, have argued that this delay was strategically significant, that the weeks lost in the Balkans were weeks that, at the end of the Russian campaign in the autumn of 1941, made the difference between German forces reaching Moscow before the Russian winter closed in and finding themselves halted short of it in the mud and ice of December. Other historians are skeptical of this argument, noting that the Yugoslav and Greek campaigns were only one of several factors that contributed to the Barbarossa delay, and that Hitler's own operational decisions in the autumn of 1941 were more decisive than the timing of the launch. The debate has not been definitively resolved. What can be said is that if the delay had any strategic impact on Barbarossa, and the German Army Group Center's diary entries from November and December of 1941 suggest that the timing was agonizingly close, Then Churchill's gamble acquired a retrospective significance that no one could have calculated in April of 1941. The men who fought in Greece and survived carried the campaign with them in different ways. Freiberg took his New Zealanders to Crete, where they would face the German paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Corps in the battle that many historians consider the most hard-fought of the entire Mediterranean War. Mackay's Australians were evacuated to Egypt and eventually returned home, their government increasingly restive about the deployment of Australian forces in campaigns that seemed to produce casualties without strategic results. Wilson himself was given other commands and continued to serve throughout the war. O'Connor, whose North African triumph had been interrupted to provide forces for Greece, was captured by Rommel in April of 1941, a painful irony, and spent the next 2 years as a prisoner of war before escaping in 1943. Greece itself entered a brutal occupation that lasted until October of 1944. The country was divided between German, Italian, and Bulgarian zones of control. The famine of the winter of 1941-42 killed an estimated 100,000 people in Athens alone, the consequence of the systematic German requisitioning of food supplies and the disruption of the agricultural economy. The resistance movements that emerged, particularly the communist-aligned Elis and the nationalist Eads, fought the occupation with considerable ferocity but also fought each other, and the wounds opened during the occupation would feed directly into the Greek Civil War that began even before the Germans withdrew and continued until 1949. The country that had inspired the world with its defiance of Mussolini's ultimatum in October of 1940 paid for that defiance and for the subsequent campaign at a cost that is difficult to measure in any currency other than suffering. The moment that perhaps best captures the moral weight of the entire enterprise is one that happened not on a battlefield but in Athens, in the pre-dawn hours of the 27th of April, 1941, as the first German motorcycles were entering the city. A German officer climbed to the Acropolis and ordered the Greek flag hauled down and the swastika raised in its place. According to an account that circulated widely in Greece during and after the war, the Evzone soldier on guard duty, Konstantinos Koukidis, refused to dishonor the flag by simply handing it over. Instead, he wrapped it around his body and threw himself from the walls of the Acropolis. The story may be apocryphal, the historical evidence for it is uncertain, and it has acquired the character of national legend rather than verified fact. But legends are not nothing. They capture something true about what a people believed about themselves and about what they had endured. The Greeks had fought. They had fought the Italians and driven them back across the Albanian frontier. They had fought the Germans at Rupel and made them pay for every meter. They had fought in the mountain passes and along the river lines and at the sea's edge. They had been defeated by forces that had defeated everyone. The defeat did not erase what had come before it. Churchill, writing in his war memoirs, described the decision to support Greece as one he did not regret. "We did not hesitate," he wrote, using the language of moral clarity that was both his greatest rhetorical gift and, sometimes, his most effective tool for suppressing doubt. Whether he was right, whether the scales of strategic calculation, balanced against the weight of moral obligation, come down on the side of intervention or restraint, is a question that admits no simple answer. The Battle of Greece in 1941 was not a victory. It was not intended to be a victory in the conventional sense. It was a statement, costly, imperfect, and freighted with consequences that rippled outward for years, that some things are worth defending even when the defense cannot succeed. Whether that statement was worth the price paid for it is, in the end, a question each generation must answer for itself, with whatever wisdom it can bring to the evidence left behind. The soldiers who went to Greece in the spring of 1941 did not make that calculation. They went because they were ordered to go, and most of them went willingly because the cause was one they understood. They fought in the mountain passes with a professionalism and courage that no subsequent judgment about the wisdom of the decision that sent them there can diminish. And in the accounting of the Second World War, that vast, terrible ledger of sacrifice and consequence, their campaign stands as one of the clearest examples of a truth that the war demonstrated again and again, that the difference between a gamble and a decision is, very often, only a matter of how it ends.